Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast, a podcast that's cutting edge, that's modern, that doesn't look backwards.
This is the old days, man, the bad days, the all or nothing days. They're back. There's no choices left, and I'm ready for war.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I'm trying really hard not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and an appreciation that it's really, really hard to get a good film through the system. Without further ado, I'm going to crack on then with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going to go back to the noughties. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story of this one the other side of this.
Get in the car, baby. We'll just talk. It'll be nice.
You just gone and done the dumbest thing in your whole life.
The truths of Sin City will be shattered.
Let the girl go.
You know who my father is? You can't do a thing to me, Hardigan.
There'll be arrests. There'll be deaths. Nothing can stop this.
Time to prove to your friends that you're worth a damn.
We'll fight the cops and the mob. We'll go to war.
This isn't some barroom, bro. This is the bad days, the all or nothing days. They're back.
And that's a clip from 2005's Sin City, directed by Frank Miller and Robert Rodriguez, with guest director Quentin Tarantino, based on Frank Miller's Sin City comic books, and starring, well, a huge ensemble really, but Jessica Alba, Benicio del Toro, Brittany Murphy, Clive Owen, Mickey Rourke, Bruce Willis, Elijah Wood, Nick Stahl, a very, very long cast list for this particular production. And so the starting point here was Frank Miller, comic book writer and artist who in 1991 debuted the first of his neo-noir strips in the Sin City series. And over the course of the 1990s, Sin City's popularity would rise, its critical and commercial acclaim would be on the up. And one of the, it wasn't really bad for Miller that by the end of the 1990s, he was one of the most in-demand comic book writers. He was working on Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One as well. And considering he'd started the 90s wrestling with scripts for RoboCop sequels, notably RoboCop 2, which I've talked about in a previous episode, also a bit of work on RoboCop 3 as well, it turned into a much better way to end the decade than to start it. Miller, though, he'd had his battles with movies. That would be fair to say. The RoboCop experience was writ large in his head, and so the idea of the Hollywood system and punting more of his work in its direction was not very high on his priority list. Now, Robert Rodriguez, meanwhile, was not Robert Rodriguez, the filmmaker we know now, when he first read Frank Miller's Sin City. And so he was a fan very early on, but the pair were a million miles apart at that stage. However, it was at the start of the 2000s that Rodriguez's career had got to the point where he could set up his own Troublemaker Studios operation. Now, he'd already had a production company since 1991 but he found that was called Los Hooligans Productions. But he set up Troublemaker Studios with Elizabeth Avellon in the early 2000s, deliberately set outside of Hollywood in Austin, Texas. And Troublemaker Studios, various magazines have done pieces on it over the years. It was basically a self-contained place where Rodriguez and his team and people who liked working with Rodriguez could go and make their films. That the sound stages were there, the post-production facilities were there, they had their own effects teams, they had pretty much everything they needed to make a movie under the Troublemaker roof. Rodriguez had always had a kind of frugal nature to him as well, that out of necessity as much as anything else, that his breakthrough film El Mariachi was released in early 1993, and it earned a lot of ink in the Hollywood trade papers in particular for reportedly costing just $7,000 to make. And for the resultant film to come out quite so well, it raised a lot of eyebrows. Rodriguez would write the story of making El Mariachi in the book Rebel Without a Crew that's well worth digging out. And whilst one or two people have cast doubt on whether it only cost $7,000 to make that film, there was a line of thinking that it's a good story that it didn't cost that much, but if that is that actually true? Nonetheless, it very much put him on the map, and El Mariachi was picked up for distribution, and then in came Columbia Pictures that hired him to effectively do a sort of more expensive remake or certainly in the same world film, which was Desperado with Antonio Banderas, that came out in 1995. But it was the relationship with Quentin Tarantino that next skyrocketed his career, that he was one of the 4 filmmakers who contributed to 4 Rooms, a real curio, really, of mid-1990s filmmaking. But Tarantino directed one of the chapters and Robert Rodriguez directed another of those. And it was From Dusk Till Dawn, really, that kind of escalated things still further. Tarantino penned the script for that, Rodriguez directed, and the pair were soon locked in, a friendship, a professional and a personal relationship was building up. Rodriguez moved on to make The Faculty, and he was making films to a budget, to a deadline that were making money, and it got to the point where he could invest the funds from making his films into the Troublemaker facility. And so one of the first beneficiaries of what Rodriguez had set up there was the Spy Kids initial trilogy of films that, again, he made his way to a tight budget and went on to significant commercial return. But still in his head too was Sin City. And Rodriguez was really, really keen to bring Frank Miller's work to the screen. And as Miller explained to Total Film in its June 2005 issue, he just started bugging me that Rodriguez wanted the rights to do the film, but Miller felt that Hollywood bluntly would pretty much ruin it. And Rodriguez's answer to this, and to try and assuage some of Miller's fears, was you shouldn't turn Sin City into a movie. Instead, you should turn cinema into a graphic novel. And that was the approach that he was going to take. But he knew he needed to work hard to convince Miller that was an approach that he could pull off. And so Troublemaker had a couple of converted aircraft hangars to work out of. And so what happened is Rodriguez recruited his sister, Patricia Vonay, and the pair of them took on roles within the film and started shooting just a story from one of the Sin City collection, in this case the story Booze, Broads and Bullets. With Rodriguez and Vonay in the starring roles just for the purposes of this, they shot against a green screen, and with Troublemaker having all the facilities on tap that it needed, the wizards there then also added the backgrounds, and what they managed to put together was a very comic book style driven look of a film. Now, we've seen this a little bit over time. When Ang Lee made his Hulk film just a couple of years before, he tried to tap into the stylings of a comic book, but this was a case of what Rodriguez was doing was effectively lifting frames from the comic book and putting them on screen. And that footage was presented to Frank Miller, and it was a head turner. There was something in there, and Miller was, it was getting to the point where the wheels were duly being greased. And Rodriguez, therefore, got what he needed to just explore it a bit further. But Ordinarily, when I do this podcast, I mean, it breaks down fairly naturally that there's a pre-filming bit, there's a filming bit, and there's a post-filming bit. But the way that Sin City was actually put together was really quite unusual, because the start of production is listed as March the 29th, 2004. But also, Frank Miller explained that when he still needed a bit of persuading, he was invited along to Troublemaker to see a test shoot of the movie, with Rodriguez saying he'd roped in a couple of friends just to help him realise a scene or two. However, when Miller got there, he saw that one of the friends was Josh Hartnett and the other was Marley Shelton. And what Miller realised then was what he was standing in the midst of was effectively the first day of production. That Hartnett and Shelton had agreed to shoot the opening scene of the Sin City movie as a favour to Rodriguez. And so Frank Miller was won over at this stage. And so Rodriguez started to break down just how he was going to make the film. And again, because he was outside the Hollywood system, he didn't have to do this all in one go. What he decided was his Sin City film was going to take 3 of Frank Miller's stories and basically film them individually and then bring them all together under the umbrella of one feature film. That he'd make the first of the stories, then he'd take a few weeks off to cast the next one, and then he'd get going on that, and then they'd take another break and get the third story going and cast that. And so he could kind of take it a little bit at his own pace. And what that meant is when it came to casting the second and third stories in the film, it was going to be a lot easier because Rodriguez could take potential actors' footage that had already been shot, but he could also edit their names into the credits. And because this was such a stylized looking production anyway, it looked really cool. The names in the credits of this, and then basically you see almost this movie-driven comic book play out in front of you. Now, Rodriguez wasn't directing this by himself, it should be noted, because what he did too was he persuaded Frank Miller to be side by side with him on the project and for Miller to be the co-director. Now, this wasn't a favour that Rodriguez was doing. This was a genuine Miller calling shots on some of the sequences, Rodriguez calling shots on others. In fact, at one stage, Quentin Tarantino was invited over to Troublemaker, with Rodriguez really looking to push to him the idea of shooting on digital cameras, which isn't something Tarantino was particularly inclined to do. However, Tarantino agreed to direct one scene of Sin City, which he did, and that is why on the poster he is credited as guest director. There is one scene in the movie that Tarantino did indeed realise for the film. Now, a lot of the filming with Sin City was also done before actors were cast, because the film was almost exclusively being shot against green screens. And so what they did is they set up a process whereby certain actors could be edited into roles during post-production, that they didn't actually need to be there for principal photography. They could come in, shoot their material entirely separately from someone else, and then the editing team would just bring that into the main feature. And to give an example of how they got one actor in particular, I mean, the big get really for the film was Bruce Willis. Now, Bruce Willis in the mid-2000s was still box office gold. I mean, he was just about to embark on the next Die Hard film, the 4th one at that stage. But to get him involved in Sin City, what Rodriguez and Miller did was they put together a DVD, and again, showing him the footage. And they wanted Willis for the key role in the film of Detective John Hartigan. And basically, once Willis saw the footage, he was persuaded in pretty much 1 minute flat that he basically stopped them and just said, I don't know what this is. I want in. This is really interesting. Now, that didn't mean that Willis didn't come with something of a reputation that we've discussed a few times on this podcast in previous episodes, that Willis was an actor on certain productions who liked to have his say and wasn't shy about, well, just cashing in some of his movie star chips to get what he wanted. But and Frank Miller, is worth noting as well, was a first-time director. And so he admitted to Total Film again that he was quite intimidated about the idea of directing Bruce Willis. And so he then relayed a story about how Willis was basically looking at the script and said, I want to have a chat about it. And Miller says, I think here it comes. But what Willis was asking Miller to do was basically put more of the books back into the film. And Miller in the end described it as, quote, an author's dream. One of the other key pieces of casting, and a genius piece of casting, if you've seen the final film, is Mickey Rourke in the role of Marv. And he was someone that Robert Rodriguez had settled on fairly early in the process as an actor he was looking to attract to the production. But Frank Miller I didn't really know him beyond a couple of film roles, and primarily the erotic thriller 9.5 Weeks. And so what Rodriguez put to Miller was, you kind of need to see him away from his movies. You need to see him in person, and that way you're going to understand why he works for this. And so Miller duly met Mickey Rourke with Rodriguez, and the meeting was clearly a successful one, and he joined the cast as well. Right throughout the shooting of Sin City and all the little blocks in which it was put together, one of the key thing, the North Star really for Rodriguez, was staying absolutely true to the comic books, right down to the look of them, right down to lines of dialogue in them. And Rodriguez was quoted in interviews around the release of Sin City as saying he felt that the films were a translation of the comic books rather than a straight adaptation of them. That there were minor nips and tucks in the edit, that there were little bits that were snipped out here and there, but still it was fundamentally what you read was what you got. Now, for Miller, he was on set at times sketching out fresh material on set and putting more ideas to Rodriguez as to what they could integrate into the films. But Rodriguez's role on this was really, well, you put it in the books, you had your chance. Well, what you signed off on the books is what we're making. And so whilst Miller was happily providing reference point and was a font of knowledge for the actors, people like Bruce Willis as well found that really, really useful. It was still going back to the comic books that had got Rodriguez interested in the first place, and he was determined to stray from them as little as possible. Another example of an actor coming in, Jessica Alba took on one of the key roles in the film, and she talked to Total Film about a dancing sequence that she had to do, one where she wouldn't be wearing an abundance of clothes, just like I'm not now. Now, Alba was keen to get this choreographed. That would be the traditional Hollywood way to do this. But Rodriguez had, of course, previously directed From Dusk Till Dawn. And that has a dancing scene with Salma Hayek that you may or may not be familiar with. And that, too, is a scene that's not particularly flooded with sartorial influences. And what Rodriguez pointed out to Alba was when they were shooting From Dusk Till Dawn, his instruction to Hayek was just go with the music, that they didn't want to overtly choreograph. So, in fact, in the end, they didn't choreograph it at all, and that was the approach that again Rodriguez wanted to take with Jessica Alba in Sin City. And Alba admitted she was a little bit intimidated by that, having been more than familiar with the work that was done in From Dusk Till Dawn. The actor who drew the short story, I'd suggest, in this was Nick Stahl, who's playing a character who, let's just say, involved a fair amount of makeup work. In fact, it was 5 hours of makeup a day for him to get into character for his role in the film. And there was, it's worth noting that it just ekes through, just in the corners of a couple of interviews that I read, that actors did struggle to a degree with the idea of consistently shooting against a green screen. Oftentimes, filming opposite actors who just simply weren't there. And we see this a little bit with animated films where various actors lay down the voice tracks for their roles entirely independently in a booth by themselves, and it's only in the post-production that it's all knitted together. It's very rare that happens with full scenes in a live action picture, but that was what was happening here. It was only Brittany Murphy who would appear in all 3 chapters of the book, and a lot of the time actors were coming in, shooting their stuff, and it might be weeks until the other actor in their scene came in to do some of their work as well. Now, that's not to say that there weren't practical elements to the shooting of Sin City, because of course there were. The swords in the film are real, the fights are real, the prosthetics are real, but virtually every set that you see in the film is virtual. And to give an example of that, there is a moment in Sin City where, for instance, Benicio del Toro's face gets pushed down into a toilet. However, what was actually happening on set was his face was being pushed into a fishbowl, and the toilet was added in post-production, a phrase I've not mentioned in this podcast previously before. But it was that level of stuff that was being created digitally to realise the look that Rodriguez wanted for Sin City. Now, the listed end of filming for Sin City was the 19th of June 2004, and this process all took place over the course of about 2.5 months. Again, very, very speedy by Hollywood standards. But of course, a lot of this was being knitted together in post-production. And for the actors, it was only really seeing the finished film that gave them a full flavour of what they were actually in. Because take Clive Owen. I mean, Clive Owen, long linked with James Bond, and in the end BMW swooped in and made Owen a Bond-like character at the heart of a bunch of very famous commercials. And it was those commercials that got Rodriguez interested in him, and he got cast in Sin City off the back of that. And so Owen had basically had to do a lot of his voiceover work, for instance, separately to his on-screen work, that he had a lot of filming commitments he had to wrap around. And he just talked to Total Film. He just said, I watched Sin City a couple of days ago and I had no idea I was in that movie. It was being put together in such granular pieces that it was only, I mean, it relied really on what was in Rodriguez's head for it all to glue together. That didn't mean, though, that the post-production was lengthy. It was done all in under a year, but then there was a lot of prep and a lot of the work was being done as filming was ongoing. But it did mean that Dimension Films, who was releasing the film, could earmark a release date of April the 1st, 2005 in the US. So that's well under a year after filming finally wrapped up. The film's actually listed basically as a co-production between Dimension and Troublemaker Studios with a budget of $40 million. There was an existing working relationship as well between the pair off the back of films such as The Faculty. And so it was a case of get the film ready for release. But there was still, just one or two little hurdles to negotiate. It's worth noting, actually, each of the three stories in the film has a different composer. That doesn't happen very often, that one of them is the score is composed by Graham Revell, another by John Debney, another by Robert Rodriguez himself. But the biggest story in post-production on Sin City was the Directors Guild of America, the DGA, getting into a bit of a narc. Because Rodriguez was insistent that Frank Miller got a co-directing credit on the film, primarily because Frank Miller had co-directed the film. Now, this did not make the Directors Guild of America happy at all. It didn't do co-director credits on its movies. And so suggestion one that Rodriguez has will give Frank Miller the full credit. He didn't really care. But Miller wasn't keen on that. He turned it down. He too felt this had been a co-directed film, and so was uncomfortable with the idea of having the credit to himself, throwing in the fact that Quentin Tarantino's guest director can't have made the DGA particularly happy either. So Rodriguez just took a look at it and just thought, right, I'm out. And so he promptly quit the Directors Guild of America, and that removed the obstacle. No longer a member of the guild, Sin City could indeed be listed with more than one director, which is how it all was ultimately put across in the marketing for the movie. So the film went before critics then. Let's jump ahead to the release. And I mean, the response to Sin City was really quite strong. That certainly the visual style was something that hadn't been seen. I don't think it had been seen at all, really, in a movie at that point. And that was something that the critics really veered towards, that it looked so markedly different to the stuff that was being served up at that time. And it was very, very clear that Robert Rodriguez loved the source material, wanted to do it absolute justice, and also had done it justice. And so whilst there was a little bit of pickiness about whether all three stories were particularly successful, the general feeling was that this was a groundbreaking film, realised on a very tight budget given the scale of the visuals that were put on screen as well, and again served as an antidote to a lot of the other stuff that was coming out from major Hollywood studios at that point. I mean, it came out in 2005, which was the year of Batman Begins as well, so I mean, it was a really, really good year for comic book movies, but Sin City felt and was different. However, it was also going out with an R rating. I mean, there's no way to tone down the material within Sin City. You're either doing it or you're not. And so would audiences turn up for that? even though the budget was relatively modest at $40 million, this was still the era where Hollywood and R ratings just didn't get on with each other, certainly not for big movies. Well, in the case of Sin City, they actually did. It opened at top spot at the American box office April the 1st to the 3rd, 2005, with a really impressive $28.1 million. Now, it did have some movie star juice on its side. Of course, Bruce Willis' presence can't have hurt at all, but it didn't sell extensively off the back of that. Still shot to the top of the chart. The other new opener that week was the film Beauty Shop, starring Queen Latifah. So I don't think there was a massive crossover between those two movies, but still interesting double bill. Happy to give it a go. The previous week's top movie had been Guess Who, which was promptly knocked off the top of the chart. That was down to 3rd. The animated movie Robots was in 4th. Miss Congeniality 2 was still around. Vin Diesel in The Pacifier. Good God, my kids used to love that film. I didn't. The underrated Kevin Costner movie, The Upside of Anger, that snuck in 8th place. Will Smith in Hitch was still around nearly 2 months after release. The thing with Sin City, though, is it's playing to such a niche crowd. The feeling was the following week's box office would drop dramatically, and it didn't really. It dropped 49%, which is on. I mean, certainly in more recent times, we've been talking about films that have dropped 60, 70%, but that was a pretty decent result as well. And the word of mouth was doing the film a few favours. The following week, it had the competition, though, of Sahara. There's a film with a story and a half we should get to at some point. That had opened with $18 million and had failed really to recapture the feel of something like The Mummy, which it felt like they were going for with that film. Fever Pitch, but the American version of Fever Pitch opened as well. Sin City was holding its own in 2nd place. It was still holding out the week after as well, and just comfortably sat in the top 5 for a few weeks until films like The Interpreter and A Lot Like Love and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy were knocking it down the chart. That notwithstanding, 2 things about Sin City. First of all, it did well in America with a $74 million gross. Outside of America, though, it also did well. This is a film that travelled, and the look of it, the visuals of it, made it an easy sell overseas too. $84.6 million for an R-rated comic book movie, worldwide gross of $158 million, and made on $40 million, made under the stewardship of a troubleshooter model that meant that they could bring this to the screen and look as it did without spending the earth. This was all felt a real success. Now, this was also the time where the DVD market was still exploding, and Robert Rodriguez certainly took advantage of that by putting out an unrated recut of the film that brought back in the material that he'd snipped out for the theatrical cut of Sin City. The theatrical cut runs to 124 minutes, the unrated version 147 minutes. And again, this is just the comic book frames that were basically filmed that he'd had to just chop down just to get the running time down a little bit. You can now find the full version of it available on physical media in a really, in America in particular, a really terrific special edition collection. Now, there was talk of a follow-up, although Rodriguez was off doing all sorts of projects. I mean, he made lots of Spy Kids films by the time this had come round, and he was not short of work to do. And so the follow-up took quite a while, and it wasn't until August 2014 that we got it, Sin City: A Dame to Kill For. However, whilst the response to the original Sin City movie had been really warm and there'd been a lot of acclaim and a lot of box office, it was completely the opposite by the time we got to the follow-up. This time, lukewarm would be putting it mildly. Critics certainly had their flesh with the second film, and the box office didn't measure up either. And whereas the first film was regarded as both a commercial and a critical hit, Sin City: A Dame to Kill For, I think it's fair to say, is regarded as a commercial and critical failure. There's still things in it worth digging out, of course, and you make your mind up. Don't let critics and box office tell you otherwise. That wasn't, though, the end of the Sin City screen story, because in 2019 came the news that a television series was being developed, and this was with the cooperation of Frank Miller again. But the plan here was that it would be a co-production with Legendary Pictures. It would be a mix of live action and animation. Rodriguez was going to potentially come on board as an executive producer of it as well. However, of course, I mean, we know what happened in 2020, something that kiboshed an awful lot of projects, and digging around, I can't find any evidence of any movement on that in the last 3 to 4 years. But 2005 Sin City still stands out as something really quite different and really bold, really interesting, and well worth watching. For whether we'll see more Sin City on the big screen, I don't know. But the worst you're going to get is the excellent comic book work of Frank Miller, and a really interesting film that remains well worth seeking out. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. This is the parish notices bit, I'm afraid. But if you can bear with me, just a couple of things to talk to you about. Firstly, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, then there are 3 ways you can do so. Financially, if you want to support us, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put a couple of coins in the pot there, you get this podcast ad-free. You get it early pretty much every week as well. You find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes too. There's been quite a lot going on. Costing you absolutely nothing is subscribing at your podcast home of choice. That's hugely appreciated. Likewise, also costing you nothing is leaving ideally a hugely positive review of the podcast. These are the kind of things that rocket fuel independent podcasts, help us get noticed by deeply sinister algorithms that have been thought up in underground bunkers of big tech companies, and anything you can do in our fight back against those is appreciated. At the time this podcast is being released, I have 3 live shows coming up. If you want to hear me waffle in person in the UK, on the 29th of March 2023, I'm at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham. The 20th of April 2023, I'm at King's Place in London. And on the 3rd of May 2023, I'm at The Light in Stockport. If you go to filmstories.co.uk, click on the live events tab, you'll find all the details of those shows there. But that is clearly enough parish notices. I'm now going to move on to the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. And this is an adaptation, a more traditional adaptation of book to film. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I believe we have a choice in this world about how to tell sad stories. On the one hand, you can sugarcoat it. And nothing is too messed up that can't be fixed with a Peter Gabriel song. I like that version as much as the next girl does. It's just not the truth. This is the truth.
Hey, make some friends.
Sorry.
My bad. I'm Augustus Waters. I've been in remission for about 1.5 years.
Maybe you'd like to share some of your fears with the group.
Fears? Oblivion. What's your name?
Hazel.
What's your full name?
Hazel Grace Lancaster. Why are you staring at me?
Because you're beautiful.
That was a clip from 2014's The Fault in Our Stars, directed by Josh Boone. Screenplay by Scott Neustadter and Michael H. Weber, based on the book The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, with a cast led by Shailene Woodley, Ansel Elgort, Laura Dern, Sam Trammell, Nat Wolff and Willem Dafoe. So I just want to take a quick minute here to talk about the label Fox 2000, which was a subdivision of the 20th Century Fox film output and film company that was given scope to hunt out low to medium priced pictures aimed at areas of the market that weren't being particularly well covered by Hollywood studios. So Fox 2000 was launched in 1994, and it would have its bumps in the road, but over time it would become particularly skilled at picking up books to adapt, with a string of hits including films such as Life of Pi and Marley and Me. And when Disney acquired Fox in 2019, the first division that Disney shut down was Fox 2000. Now, this has been recorded in March 2023, and there are arguments now as to whether Disney buying Fox turned out to be a good thing for Disney, yet alone for Fox. But what's clear is nothing's really filled the gap that's been left behind by Fox 2000. There isn't a major studio that's actively seeking out kind of low to mid-price book adaptations. And so it makes films like The Fault in Our Stars just a bit less likely to happen now, at least outside of the streaming arena, where I think even now budgets are being challenged. So let's talk about author John Green. For his 6th novel, he fashioned a story about a 16-year-old girl called Hazel who has cancer and goes to a support group for other people who are battling cancer, and that's where she meets 17-year-old Augustus. He, of course, is also a cancer patient, and the plot of the film follows their adventures from that point on. Now, Green would, he put out a thing saying he would sign each individual copy of the first run of the book, which turned out to be a particularly terrific idea for him when there were 150,000 copies of the book for that first printing. By distance, it was his most successful novel to that stage. It shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list at great speed, and Green got through a fair amount of Sharpies as he was signing each copy of the book that first went out. Now, he'd had a couple of dealings with Hollywood to this point. There had been talks about getting some of his films made. But the advance buzz for the novel, which was aided too when it was accidentally sent out early to some readers at one stage, well, that buzz got Hollywood's attention. Green, too, was actively looking for a Hollywood deal, it seemed, at this point. He'd just switched his film representation from the agency William Morris to United Talent Agency instead. And United Talent Agency was shopping around his books with a view of picking up a film deal for them. And so it was the film producer Whit Godfrey who took note of The Fault in Our Stars first, or certainly came to prominence in the hunt to sign it up for a movie adaptation. Whit Godfrey's Temple Hill Company had enjoyed success with the likes of Twilight. You might have heard of Twilight. Was also involved in the adaptation of Eragon, which had been set up at 20th Century Fox that didn't quite launch the franchise that had been intended. But Godfrey was really, really keen on The Fault in Our Stars. And ultimately, it would be Godfrey that signed the book up and got Fox 2000 interested. The deal announced 3 weeks after the publication of The Fault in Our Stars in January 2012, at a point where Green was still touring the US promoting it. But the story was that it was Whit Godfrey that approached the president of Fox 2000, Elizabeth Gabler, with the idea. But she, at that point, was right in the middle of trying to get Life of Pi made. That was a big production, a risky production, an expensive production. And Gabler was really being pulled from pillar to post trying to get that through the Hollywood system. However, Gabler too liked the novel, but was a little reluctant at trying to get another project that looked incredibly difficult to make made. However, it was Whit Godfrey who just really convinced her in the end and called her up and said, you just can't pass on this, you've got to do it. And Gabler said, why are you doing this to me? And it was Godfrey who said, because it makes you remember when you were a teenager, when you were in love for the first time, you didn't want to hang up the phone. And as Elizabeth Gabler would say, I just said, I hate you, laughing, agreed to take on the film, but with two particular conditions that had to be met for it. Number one was, quote, we have to make this movie for no money. And the other, quote, we have to be very, very careful about all of our choices. There is, it's quite sensitive subject matter in The Fault in Our Stars. Also, it was very clear that it was quickly becoming a beloved book of a lot of people. So there were a lot of downsides to getting this particularly wrong, if it did indeed go wrong. Scott Neustadter and Michael Weber were hired to oversee the adaptation of the book, and they put their script together across 2012. And the script landed well too, because it landed on the blacklist of unmade screenplays at the end of 2012. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the blacklist, this is voted for by Hollywood insiders and is the compilation of the best unmade scripts that were doing the rounds in Hollywood at the time. And so in the 2012 blacklist, the script for The Fault in Our Stars got 17 votes. It was one place below in the chart to a film called Whiplash. Wonder what happened to that. Interestingly, with 29 votes was the film Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. I love that film a lot. And Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, let's just say there is crossover to a degree with the themes that are being explored in The Fault in Our Stars. The film that topped the blacklist that particular year, and it topped it by a mile, was the movie Draft Day, that will ultimately get made with Ivan Reitman directing and Kevin Costner starring. But the script was clearly passing muster. And in November 2012, even as the script was being well received, the director rumours were underway. And the first candidate really to come to prominence was the filmmaker Stephen Chbosky. He'd helmed The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which a teen film that had sparked and had a bit of an edge to it and really enjoyed a reasonable amount of success as well. And that film landed him a meeting with Fox 2000, and the subject of The Fault in Our Stars came up. And so for a little while, he was rumoured to be the person who was going to be taking the job on. But in February 2013, he told the website Hyperball that The Fault in Our Stars is terrific. I did meet on that particular movie, but that one I won't be doing. He felt, as was reported, it was a little bit too close to The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and he wanted to do something a little bit different. That same month, though, February 2013, we did learn who the director of the film was going to be, and it was announced that Josh Boone had got the job. Not a particularly well-known name at that point. He'd gone on to do The New Mutants since, which I've covered in a previous episode of this podcast. But Boone had been a huge fan of the book. He'd also, the themes had resonated as well. I mean, he'd made his first film, Stuck in Love, starring Jennifer Connelly and Greg Kinnear, and Nat Wolff as well, who would pop up in The Fault in Our Stars. But just ahead of filming Stuck in Love, he'd lost a friend to illness, and as a result, the book really just hit him. As it hit many other people as well. So he was very keen to take the project on and met and duly got the job. Now, at this stage, Stuck in Love hadn't been released, but Boone's appointment came too with the news that Fox was looking to get shooting on The Fault in Our Stars moving quickly, that the trade press announcement suggested the summer of 2013 was when the film was going to go before cameras. This was moving at some speed, but then this was also arguably the book's moment. It was being talked about, it was selling a ton of copies, and it made sense to get going as fast as you possibly could to make the most of all of that, which meant with a director on board, a script in place, and the aim of shooting just a few months after we'd learned who the director was going to be, well, the casting needed to come together at relative speed too. It was in March 2013 that we learnt who was going to take on the key role of Hazel in the film. After what was described as an exhaustive search, how often do we hear that phrase? It was at that stage a relative unknown, but not totally unknown, called Shailene Woodley, who was offered the role of Hazel, edging out several other people were in the running for it. Haley Steinfeld was mentioned, but 250 actors had been seen for the role of Hazel. But it was Woodley who was the one who really impressed. And again, she was a big fan of the book too. She'd banked some high-profile roles at this stage as well. She'd been cast in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 as Mary Jane, although she would be lopped out of that film in post-production. And she'd been cast in the lead role of the soon-to-shoot Divergent, which was intended to launch a teen movie franchise that would rival the likes of Twilight and The Hunger Games and films of that ilk. The highest profile project that she'd been involved with that had actually been released at this point was Disney's The Descendants. But still, she wrote to John Green and Josh Boone about the role. She really wanted it. But that was something that kind of put Boone off a little bit at first, because he had concerns about Shailene Woodley before he met her. The character in the book is 16. She was 22 at this point. That's nothing on Michael J. Fox in the Back to the Future films, but let's gloss over that. But it took the audition really to make him realise fairly quickly that she was the right choice. Once Hazel was in place, well, the chemistry reading could take place for the lead male role, Augustus, and that was narrowed down to 6 candidates, and Ansel Elgort was cast in the film in May 2013 after being brought for chemistry reading with Woodley. In July 2013, in came Laura Dern and Nat Wolff to join the ensemble too. And John Green, he was just conscious of what was happening here and was relatively protective of his work too, as he told Entertainment Weekly just heading towards production. The people who are making the movie are aware of how passionately the readers of the book feel, and they respect that and they want to honour that. And he said that, like me, they're terrified of failing to live up to readers' expectations. And he says, I think that's really healthy. But he admitted, this is something I never expected to happen in my life, because I don't write the kind of books that make big Hollywood movies, but I'm so grateful and excited. Now, just because it felt like a big Hollywood movie, it wasn't really, in the scheme of things, a big Hollywood movie. It was being made by effectively a boutique arm of Fox. It also had a budget of just $12 million for, a fairly ambitious movie that they were putting together. And as a result, people were having to work for a reduced fee on the production, but it was a whole bunch of people who really cared about the book and wanted to do the job. And so it was on the 26th of August 2013, in the end, that production kicked off on The Fault in Our Stars, taking place primarily in the Pittsburgh area of the US. Willem Dafoe's casting was announced just a week or two after the start of production. He took on the role of Peter Van Houten, announced very, very, very late. Even though the bulk of the film is set in the US and was shot in Pittsburgh, there was a moment, and there is a moment, and I'm going to spoiler light as possible, that involved Anne Frank's house, which is in Amsterdam. Now, somewhat inevitably, the overseers of Anne Frank's house are very, very protective of it and aren't particularly keen on letting film crews in. And so when The Fault in Our Stars production office asked, could we go and film in Anne Frank's house, they were told, no, you can't. And so what had to happen there was two things. Firstly, that a skeleton crew really went to Amsterdam for 3 days of shooting. In fact, the only members of the cast who went for that were Shailene Woodley and Ansel Elgort. And so they did filming in and around Anne Frank's house, but for the sequences that take place inside the house, well, they had to rebuild that on a soundstage in a bit more of a traditional Hollywood way. One person who was on set for a lot of the filming was, again, the author of the book, John Green. This was not a case of the author being sidelined. I mean, he'd not written the screenplay for it, but he was also, he was really the font of all knowledge on The Fault in Our Stars. And so he was a constant reference point for the filmmakers. And it got to the point where he shot a small appearance in the film as well. And wouldn't you know it, that was snipped out in post-production. The practical elements of the shoot, well, they were down to conversations about getting the right texture of vomit. I mean, sorry if you're eating on this. I mean, Entertainment Weekly described, and again, sorry fans of lunch, whether to go. I mean, it was Josh Boone basically had to choose between three different options that went from, I'm quoting, green to chunky brown. It was a film about sickness, though, that amongst other themes, that had its light moments during the shooting of it, but they weren't lost on what they were actually making. And so it was a committed production, one that was, as much as there were lots of laughs, there were a couple of tonally darker moments throughout the shoot. And it wrapped up fairly comfortably on the 18th of October 2013. And so, even while that was going on, the fan anticipation for the Fault in Our Stars movie was bubbling up, that there'd been a lot of interest in the physical production of the film, that there were reports of when it was shooting, how it was shooting, why it was shooting, all the usual that you would expect almost. To a degree, the attention on it from some quarters was like a Batman film or a Spider-Man film. There was it's a hugely popular book. It remains a hugely popular book. And seeing how the film was going to shape up, well, that was something that a lot of Hollywood press was tapping into. The first poster for it then came out at the end of 2013. That got shared far and wide, but perhaps the first litmus test to whether the book audience would really remain interested in the film was when the trailer came out. And the first trailer hit at the end of January 2014, and the response to it was huge. Huge viewing figures for it, positive response to it as well, and the runes were looking good for The Fault in Our Stars. That the premiere for it had been set for the Seattle International Film Festival in May of 2014, ahead of a wide release in the US. They'd gone for summer, June the 6th, 2014, for a $12 million movie that wasn't aiming broadly at the whole audience. I believe the cliche is the 4-quadrant movie. This was playing to a fan base of a book and to teenage market, so still a sizable target to aim for, but still the confidence to put it out in the middle of summer, well, that was quite something. The first reviews that came through also suggested that the team behind the film had got it right, that the response to it was enthusiastic, that appreciating that, you know, some of the notes of the film you could spot a fair distance off. There was a feeling that they'd done a good job on this, and in particular for those who took the book to their heart, this was going to be a special film. One or two people were quite keen to knock it down. I think they were arguing it's quite manipulative, but this is a story that had been told successfully in book form and had worked in book form, and the feeling was it was also working in film form as well. But would the audience turn out to watch it? Well, you know the answer to that. Of course they did. They turned out in huge numbers, and that weekend of June the 6th to the 8th, 2014 saw it against some stiff competition that Maleficent had opened the week before and done a huge amount of money. A Tom Cruise movie was opening the same weekend as well. But it was The Fault in Our Stars that topped the chart, $48 million in its opening weekend. Number one by reasonable distance from Maleficent, which banked $34 million in its second weekend. And Edge of Tomorrow, brilliant film, Edge of Tomorrow, $28 million. Other films around, I mean, this was blockbuster season. X-Men Days of Future Past was 3 weeks in and nearly $200 million in the bank. A Million Ways to Die in the West hadn't done quite as well. Gareth Edwards' take on Godzilla, that was nearly at $200 million. That was still in 6th place in the charts. Blended with Adam Sandler was around. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had just dropped out of the chart as well. The Fault in Our Stars, though, was a hit after 1 week. It did lose a lot of its audience in the second week, that as much as the word of mouth was positive, the book audience turned out in droves that first weekend. It dropped nearly 70%. Its second weekend, it dropped to 5th place with another 14 million banked. But then the competition was tough. It was releasing in summer. The week after, 22 Jump Street had been released, for instance, 57 million, smashed to the top of the chart, holding off How to Train Your Dragon 2, 49 million. These were big numbers being thrown around. And The Fault in Our Stars, well, I mean, it was competing, but there was a lot of competition out there. That didn't stop it more than earning its keep, though. By the time it left US cinemas, I mean, Fox would have been thrilled with this. $124 million just from US takings alone. And this one travelled as well. $182 million outside of America, a worldwide gross for this $12 million adaptation of a book that was supposed to have a fairly limited audience. $307 million. And of course, it went nuts when it made home formats as well, that the disc release was hugely popular. In fact, the disc release included an extended version of the film too, which brought in John Green's cameo. The theatrical cut is 126 minutes, the extended version 133 minutes. And The Fault in Our Stars was a hit both at home, was a hit on the big screen as well. For John Green, this opened up his Hollywood work. That Paper Towns would follow shortly afterwards, again set up at Fox. And there was a second adaptation of The Fault in Our Stars as well. A Bollywood remake of the film was announced in the summer of 2014. What do you know? That was very well received as well, and that did really, really well. This, which brings us back to where we started really, that the studio that existed that was actively looking for books like this to film and then put them out in cinemas, it's just gone. And we're less than 10 years after The Fault in Our Stars had made this big amount of money, made a huge profit, and proven that this is the kind of film that can get people into cinemas and get people into cinemas in such numbers. And the apparatus and the mechanism to do so just is still there. I mean, clearly you can still adapt a book and get it released on the big screen, but is the desire from studios to pick up projects like this anymore still there? Or is almost like a sense of resignation that this has been handed over to streamers? If that is the case, and it's no slight on streamers, it would be a real pity, because shared experiences of watching films like The Fault in Our Stars in cinemas, appreciating it's not a film loved by all of you, nonetheless for its audience, and I like the film, I still love Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, but I like the film, I enjoyed watching it with an audience, and this is the kind of film that does, I'd suggest, belong on the big screen as much as any big blockbuster. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. And as always, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. If I've not bored the shoes off you, you can get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online, youtube.com/Film Stories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news and reviews and mayhem and mischief. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, you can buy our print magazines. I am a print magazine nerd. We have done 41 issues and counting of Film Stories magazine. The current issue leads on the Tetris movie and a huge interview with the director of that as we dig into the extraordinary story behind it. Store.filmstories.co.uk is where you'll find that. And the Patreon was patreon.com/Simon Brew. But I'm at the point now where I'm boring myself, so you must all be incredibly bored. So I'm going to log off and leave you to it. As always, thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you for supporting it. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves and stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.